Well, after that introduction, I have some justification to make. I'm delighted to be here. I suppose it's particularly valuable for me to not only be able to show you the films, but also to talk about them. As proto-cinema makers, and indeed cinema directors, you know so frequently the contradiction. The filmmakers very rarely actually meet and discuss their cinema with you, the audience. So it's a particular pleasure and interest to be able to make that connection. Okay, I have been challenged again by your prolix speaker about this situation, which I think by now I'm boring everybody by saying that cinema is dead. People's first response is really, well, if cinema is dead, why, Mr. Greenaway, are you still making it? Well, I think the cheap answer really is because I'm extremely stupid. That really what I do now somehow curiously begins already, as it were, straight after the film premiere, straight into the museum. Let me give you two big reasons, first of all, and also we can add many other extra medium, I suppose, about the notion for my provocation. Let me ask you, the audience, a question. Who of you actually watches silent cinema? Be bold. Okay, I'm well aware that a lot of you are film archivists and film historians. You certainly put your hand up. Anybody else? You know, oh, you do. There's quite a number of you who actually watch silent cinema. But you know the sort of the basic, I suppose, proposal about the notion of cinema between, 1895 and 1929, is that we often try to entertain children at Christmas time with films of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, for example. And then if you're an archivist or historian and you want to know what tram cars in Chicago looked like in 1923, well, you look up the film. But as an entertainment and illuminating instruction medium, compared to, I suppose, the notion of ideas of sound cinema, relatively few people are actually engaged in what some people have calculated as over 15 million films. 15 million films all over the world were made between 1895 and 1929, and they were supposedly belonging to that phenomenon called silent cinema. Mind you, I have a lot of doubts about what silent cinema was or is. I think all filmmakers for all time have always been fascinated by the notion of indeed a soundtrack, and there were many, many ways, apart from the pianist sitting in the dark on the corner of the stage, Abel Gance, for example, using cannon and chicken on the audience, and all sorts of other organizations of people talking through the film. You must know, you film historians, there were very, very many different attempts to try and make silent cinema not silent. So that's a dubious categorization anyway, but I think before the notion of optical sound in 1929, the silent cinema as a category is fully understandable. I just made a film about Eisenstein, and Eisenstein, along with Charlie Chaplin, thought that the introduction of sound was the worst possible thing you could have done with the notions of cinema. Cinema surely is meant to be a visual medium. Witness the rather poetic title that I've written up here on the screen. But I would argue that we certainly do not have an image-based cinema. We have a text-based cinema. Every single film you or I have ever seen is associated deeply and profoundly with text and notions of narrativity and all the characteristics of the vocabulary of literature. Basically, we make cinema all over the world, not just in the West, with a view to the novel form, its psychological apparatus, its distribution of notions of ethics, its metaphysics, if you like, and certainly the way it's constructed is very much related to the novel. We've had, a novel now for about 350 years in the world, even if you regard maybe Japanese novels of the year 1000 with people like, say, Shonagon. But I suppose we should start really maybe I suppose about the time of the French Revolution, the beginning of the Western novel. Beginnings, middles, and ends, psychological development, notions of Christian ethic, they're still with us now. And they become part and parcel, indeed, of the cinema experience. I always thought it was relevant that Freud wrote his first paper on female hysteria 3 weeks before the Lumiere brothers pronounced the first film in Christmas, 1895, at Maxime's in Paris. Is that merely coincidental? The notion of a psychodrama for our performance of the notions of activity in cinema are relative in a curious way with the growth of psychoanalysis, and I don't think that's particularly changed. Bazin, in 1936, said the cinema was a combination of literature, the theater, and if you were very lucky, some painting. And I don't think that's really changed very much. The circumstances that cinema knows it doesn't really create its own material, it always, 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 always has to go back to the bookshop in order to create its content, which I think is a disaster. Text has got so many ways to purvey its meaning. We've had 8,000 years going back to Homer and before of lyric textual poetry. We've had, I suggested, 350 years of the novel form, and we've had theater from ever since whenever. And the theater always hands down its meaning essentially through text, text, text. Why can't we have a medium that is prepared and is confident enough to be able to explain its associations, its existence, its raison d'etre, through the notion of communication of the image? Going back to Eisenstein and Charlie Chaplin, it's suggested that maybe the most successful period of true cinema and not illustrated text, which is what most cinema is about, must be the years from about 1923 to 1929, when cinema was sophisticated enough to be able to understand its potential, but did not need the support. I have to be careful here, because there are always intertitles, but essentially did not need the support of narrativity and text to hold its meaning. You know how it goes. Let me make a comparison about a visit to an art gallery. You go to the Louvre, for example, or you go to your major art gallery in this country, and you see people peering at the paintings. And they look a little nonplussed, because they don't really understand what's going on, but they lean forward and they read the legend, the caption, underneath the painting, and it says, "Woman with a red parrot." All right, you suddenly think, this is about a woman with a red parrot. That's what it's all about. They forget the painting, and they move on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. What on earth do they understand they think they're doing? They have been totally comforted by a text, which is the way that most of the world communicates, constantly, constantly, constantly. I bet you, looking back at your experience of being a child, by the time you were about 9 or 10 or 11, in your schoolroom, the teacher would say or imply, put away the crayons, put away the easel, you've got to get serious now. You've got to earn your living, pay the grocery bill, look after the mortgage. You've now got to become text proficient. And of course we all are. I mean, I'm amazed how all of the people I meet here in this country speak English so well. So even across all the language barriers, we are very, very sophisticated at handling ideas of text, both written and spoken. When you compare the amount of attention, the amount of interest, the amount of fascination we spend with text, it's no wonder we're very good at it. Our mothers, presumably, were the first people that taught us our initial vocabulary. Then we went to primary school and secondary school, and we began to amass the words and understand how they worked. And even as adults, we still polished the ability to communicate. But how much attention do anybody, apart from those who perhaps have what I would call a real education in looking and seeing, how many people actually spend as much attention, as much practice, as much interest, as much fascination in the perfection of a language which is visual as opposed to literary? Now, I know there's a way that you are a rather specialized audience. You are some way or another connected to the notions of cinema, but let me ask you a question. Do you think that you are visually literate? Who has been to art school? Put your hands up high. Now, you're a special audience. You're not just an average audience taken out of the street because you have this background. That's why you're here in this cinema. But I think then, put your hands up again. Yeah, there's only about maybe 8 to 10% of the audience who put their hands up. That means the whole rest of you are visually illiterate. Art and culture is not egalitarian. You have to learn. Notions of culture is very elitist. You know that. Even maybe your socialist principles react against that. And you think, I've got eyes, I can see. But can you see? Rembrandt said, just because you've got eyes does not mean that you can see. Now, those people who put their hands up probably know about the golden section and Fibonacci numbers and 2 dimensions versus 3 dimensions and color theory. They probably read, I don't know, people like Poussin. You probably read Paul Klee's Seeing Eye. You've done all the literature. Am I right? Am I right? You have all that knowledge. Most people don't, of course. Most people don't at all. Most people don't realize why the Virgin Mary always wears a blue cloak, but there's a particular reason for that, and it's part of visual education. There's a huge amount of visual education. After all, I suppose most of us would regard what the last 500 years, let's go back to the Renaissance, let's go back to the year 1400. Most of us calculate, I suppose, our imagery. Look at this theater, look at the ceiling here. It's all related to imagery that's been created by painters in the last 400 years. But painting, of course, is much, much older than that. Certainly we could take it back to Christ. My favorite starting point would be Pompeii, excavations of course, much more recently, but the explosion of the volcano happened in 74 AD, so that's one of the first times we actually really understood that the notions of European painting have a deep, deep history in terms of Roman painting, most of which, of course, has disappeared because of notions of weathering and history, etc. But we could go back even further, of course, and we could go back certainly to the Greeks, and if you really want to, we could go all the way back, 42,000 years to the cave paintings in the south of France. I understand now that even more cave paintings have been discovered, and the date has been gone back probably to about 56,000 years ago. A long, long heritage, most of it, of course, totally unseen. But there has been a way that our knowledge of the world is related, of course, to what our eyes see. All our semiotics, all our notions of alphabets, of notions of hieroglyphics are related, of course, to a visual phenomenon. And you all know, being a history student, what that means, and I don't have to underline it. But it is extraordinary, isn't it, that this concern for dumping our understanding, our comprehension of ourselves and the world is all related to text, 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 text. Now, I certainly, of course, it would be ridiculous to be able to deny text totally. It has created enormous amounts of advantage in civilization. Of course it has. But what I'm saying is, why do we have to label and organize this one opportunity to make a medium of communication through the image with all this wretched bookshop concern? What are the last big things in cinema in the last 15 years? Wretched Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. You know these aren't films, are they? They're not films, they're books. You could go down to the marketplace and actually buy them. But it's a condition, isn't it, of all cinema, and all your cinematic directorial heroes have all done the same thing. Eisenstein certainly did. Godard certainly does. Fellini does. All the American directors desperately need a script. You know, and I know probably, that it's absolutely a waste of time going to a film producer or a film studio with 4 paintings, 3 drawings, and a book of prints and say, give me the money. They won't know what the fuck you're talking about. Most producers are totally visually illiterate. I don't really think it's their fault particularly. I think it's related to the fact of our education system all over the world. The way we diminuize the value and significance of the image up against what we think is the priority of the text. And certainly I believe it's a huge, huge re-education process. I've often thought that maybe one of the best educations for encouraging the notion of use your eyes, use your eyes, use your eyes, become visually literate, is to be indeed associated with the cinema and certainly primarily to become a film director. You need to know so much, at least theoretically. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, around about 60 AD, said that the best education in the world for anybody was to become an architect. You have to know about history, posterity, materials, politics, money, finance, etc., etc. You have to know everything before you're in a good position to build a substantial and worthwhile and profitable building. I still think, of course, that's true, and it's constantly re-educated in a sense all the time. A huge amount of architecture is going on in the world now, which in some ways are extraordinarily stimulating. But I also think, in terms of actually visualization, to be studying in a cinema ought to have all that same phenomenon. Now, I know, with titles like what is the word? It's a very pompous word, isn't it? Very complicated, pompous word. Transvisual, how do you pronounce it? Come again? Well, I think the fact that you're laughing, you agree with me, the pompousness of that word. My assistant said, you've got to go to this. It's such an umbrella, you can talk about anything under that title. Which, of course, is true. But I found in my experience that often works like that. Oh, we must get Greenaway to come and talk. Let's throw something, that's vague and big and can embrace everything in the dustbin, and we'll get him to say something. But there is a purpose there, of course, and it is, I think, relevant to what I'm saying. I'm arguing for a cinema which is primarily about the image and not about the word. Now, it's difficult because, would you agree with me, most people come to the cinema to be told a story. Is that true? But when I ask you to tell me the story back again, when I ask you to tell me the story of Spider-Man, of Star Wars, of Casablanca, okay, you'll start off optimistically, but I bet you'll dry up within 1 minute. Should we try that experiment? Let me ask that lady who's grinning there. Blade Runner must be an important movie for you, isn't it? It is for me. Blade Runner? Yes? Tell me what's one of you. Yes, I'm looking at you. Don't pretend I'm not looking at you. You. What's your favorite film?
I can't speak, I'm sorry.
No, I was actually referring to the lady behind you in the back row. No? All right, well, you're also shy. Of course, I'm not going to be able to push this too far, as we're all going to get embarrassed. But there is a way, if you ask somebody to tell me the story of Casablanca, they say, well, it all happens, in here, and it's just about this, and it's got this, and this, and this. And then they shut up. Because essentially, the rest of what we might call the narrativity, the textual basis of the film is gone. Because cinema is not about telling stories, and it's not about the notion, in a sense, of the idea of the illustrated novel. What you remember about a great film is a particular which is somehow outside and beyond text. That's why cinema is so amazing. A particular connection between a color, a piece of performance, a screen, a landscape, a composition, that's what you remember. You remember these golden moments. There's almost stage by stage by stage. I don't think you ever remember a film continuously. It's bits and pieces. You say, oh, do you remember that extraordinary shot? Do you remember what happened then? Do you remember that? And of course we do. But the actual narrativity, what I would call, I suppose what people would regard the cement that holds the bricks together, was gone. But we pay an awful lot of attention to film writers, don't we? You know, Hollywood is full of film writers, and the huge number of scripts that exist will never, never, ever be made into films. It's all the product of writing, writing, writing. My feeling is if you want to be a writer, be a novelist, be an author, and at least you have total control over your medium. You don't have to hand it over to other imaginations, and you're totally free of all that necessary straitjacketing which is relevant to notions of text in the cinema. I rather suspect there are probably some film writers in the audience, yes? Own up, yes? Because I think you all ought to be shot. I think you're a waste of time, film writers. We don't need a writer's cinema. Writing is writing is writing, and filmmaking is different things. At the very best, the very, very best, the writing can only be a cheap guide to the way in which a film is manufactured. I'm not going to win this battle, though, am I? You know, Godard, probably the greatest filmmaker of the middle of the 20th century, said, all right, this is the way we've invented cinema. First of all, you have to have words before you can have pictures. First of all, you have to have a scheme that's based upon a novel before you can make the notion of a film. Okay, let's play that game. Let's write our script as well as we can, select our producer, send it to him, get him to read it, try all sorts of tricks to make sure he reads it, and if he's fascinated and he takes it and he's prepared to put the money down, take the money. This is, I suppose, Godardian days of the 1960s. Make sure that check goes into the bank. Wait for 3 days to make absolutely sure that check has gone in the bank. Then take the money and throw the script away and go and make a film. But a film is not a script. Absolutely, yes? You know, another extraordinary thing, and I'm finding it true because I still make documentaries occasionally. I'm about to make a documentary about Martin Luther. But the only way I can get the money to make a film, a documentary, is to write a script. Isn't that ridiculous? To write a script for a documentary. Isn't the whole business about a documentary an investigation? You don't really know what you're going to make until you've made it. Isn't that what's exciting about a documentary? You don't go out and follow the instructions which are written down on a piece of paper. Waste of time. But you can see how it's done like that. It's because, the money's difficult to get, and the producers, are chary of giving it out, and they want to really feel that they're in control and they know what's going to be made. That has created, I suppose, a really miserable documentary tradition where everything is foretold before we even begin. Okay, we can make excuses for the feature film, and we can understand maybe, under current circumstances, why, in fact, the script is necessary. Supposedly, I suppose, for producers to protect their money, basically. It's also a control mechanism, again, which is very, very dubious. So let me come back to the state again of why I am a filmmaker. It is of enormous curiosity and fascination about the idea of explaining ourselves and the world through images and not through text. I don't know, you're all Roman Catholics, aren't you? I really am surprised how many of you are Roman Catholics in the year 2016. Really shocked and surprised. I thought the Vatican had given up on Europe, just worried about superstitious South America and South Africa. Extraordinary. I've gone around shaking people's hands because I haven't met so many Roman Catholics before. I didn't think they existed. But there's a way, isn't there? That these notions, I said before, our cinema basically around the world is basically a Christian cinema, isn't it? It begins with negativity and moves to positivity. If you're American, happy endings. If you're European, resolved endings, but not necessarily very happy. But that notion of the idea of capitalism, Christianity, both in English begin with the letter C, both offer pie in the sky when you die, both are this notion of moving from the negative to the positive. And ideas like renunciation and all those things all come to mind when you make these sort of particular comparisons. I've got sidetracked now. I use that opportunity to shout at you about being Roman Catholic. So there is a way then that if we really do believe, and should we not really believe, that we now have an extraordinary new visual possibilities with our digital revolution. I give you a date. I believe this is the date when cinema died, and the beginnings, indeed, of the digital visual revolution. And it's the 31st of September, 1983, when the zapper, or the remote control, was introduced into the living rooms of the world. Heretofore, notions of cinema, even cinema on television, was very passive. You didn't have an interaction with the phenomenon. You know, you couldn't interfere with the editing, you couldn't change the color or anything like that. But on that date, the 31st of September 1983, you could sit on your sofa, you could push a button, at the very least you could turn the film on and you could turn the film off. Well, 1983 is a long time ago, and an awful lot has happened. But now, look, you know, you can now remake Star Wars. You've got the vocabulary, you've got the software, you could re-edit it, you could do all the changing, you could make it. Somebody had written about black and white films. You could make Star Wars totally black and white. You could change everything. You know, there are various forms of software that you can now take photographs like Cartier-Bresson. You can now take photographs like Helmut Newton. All the software is arranged for you to make a manifestation which apparently is relative to the characteristics of both these photographers and cinematographers and filmmakers. So that's a huge difference. Is there anybody in the audience who doesn't have a laptop, who doesn't have a mobile phone, who doesn't have some form of camera recorder? There's no really determined radical that has no desire to be associated with these things. Is there anybody? Sometimes I ask that question, and somebody in the back puts their hands up and says, I haven't got a mobile phone. And then we go into a long argument about why, and all sorts of really interesting, situations come up. I expect you can imagine what they are. But I think, asking somebody if they have not got a mobile phone, they haven't got a laptop, and they haven't got a camera recorder is a bit like saying, do you read? It's so important to be a citizen of the contemporary world, to be associated with these means of production. And that's not meant to be a Marxist-Leninist comment. The actual notion, I in my pocket have a pencil. I'm not terrified of this pencil, and neither are you. But there is a way in which this pencil is no more, no less sophisticated than this huge notion of the technological revolution. We can easily learn, we can all of us easily learn how to handle these technologies, and of course all of us can. My father refused to use a typewriter. He was a businessman in London, and he said typewriting was for women. Only women were allowed to typewrite. It was beneath him. But now everybody, extraordinarily, silently, everybody can type extremely well on a laptop. Isn't that true? And more so either than, indeed, my father or the women he was denigrating. And now we understand, what Palatino is and what New Times Roman is. We're very sophisticated now in fonts. We have a great more understanding of the whole notion of the printing press and the printing industry. It's been a quiet revolution, but it's really happened. And it's just proof that anybody, even my deeply prejudiced father, can actually learn to type. Maybe with 2 fingers, but why not? I suppose he would say, if I can type with 2 fingers and it's good enough, why should I use 5? But then I'm now denigrating my father, and he's not here to defend himself, so I'm going to shut up. So all these ideas, let's truly make a cinema that's related to its characteristics. The McLuhan phase, the medium is the message. The medium is the message. We throw that away so easily, we don't really think about it, but it really is very, very profound. And I think that's something we should establish. How does all this relate to me? Well, I am very privileged. I've made over 100 films. We're now going to make our 14th feature film about Brancusi, the Romanian sculptor. And I suppose we've made many, many films and documentaries and all sorts of short films and long films about all sorts of subject matter. And I have been given enormous amounts of freedom. There is a way that I have never become rich by making cinema. We did make a film several years ago called The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover. Maybe you've seen it. It did win, I think, about $50 million US. But I think that's the most rewards we've ever got financially. But I've always argued there are much better currencies than money. Money is a very poor currency. The currencies of self-satisfaction, of creating something which is truly valuable, truly interpretative, truly communicative, has a much more satisfying feel than earning 50 million. Okay, as young filmmakers or filmmakers desperate for money, you might totally disagree with that. But I'm sure in your heart of hearts you know that's true. So what has happened, I suppose, that I have filmically led two separate filmic lives. One of the lives is related to European art cinema, The Cook and the Thief, indeed, The Pillar Book, Draftsman's Contract, but another is related more to museums and art galleries. Museums and art galleries realize, of course, and you know this, that film is an extraordinary educative medium. Horace, around about, 100 AD, suggested every great work of art has to be a great combination between entertainment and instruction. If it's totally only about entertainment, it blows away and you forget about it. Hollywood, Bollywood. And if it's totally instructive, people are so bored, they're not engaged. So you have to find a way. This could be said about the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, that it's both got to be instructive and entertaining. And if you can get that balance right, you can apply it to any great work of art that you've seen anywhere. I would also argue, since I've just made a film about Eisenstein, who was considered to be a Soviet propagandist, that all great propaganda makes great art, and all great art makes great life. So please don't be frightened about the notion of propaganda. Let's go back to Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. I don't think anybody, do they, really think the Sistine Chapel is a work of propaganda for Roman Catholicism? Of course it is, but we don't think of it like that. But if you think about Battleship Potemkin by Eisenstein, people somehow dismiss it and say, oh, that was just Stalinist propaganda. So I think we have to be very careful about that sort of phenomenon. You can see I've been thinking about this and are constantly criticized for it, so it's really the top of my imagination to discuss it. So this second life, is created by funding and enthusiasm and excitement about this nexus of entertainment stroke instruction, which is related to what museums and art galleries do. And you know, in the world today, the buildings that are most being built are now museums. Dubai has 5 museums, there's nothing in them. But they've actually built them because they are the best and potential money-gathering status symbol. I think it was, about 20 years ago, people were building opera houses. It's a long time since people have been building cathedrals. So the notion, again, I suppose, of cathedrals, I suppose we ought to think about sports arenas. Think of all these architects who are now building Olympic stadiums, etc. So let's say cathedrals, Olympic stadiums, opera houses, and I don't know, the more I think about it, the more the idea begins to collapse. But you can understand how society somehow focuses its activity on what it thinks is most best and most relevant to notions of living. And there is a way that I suppose, without in any way denying it, my interest is often very academic. I'm passionately interested in painting. And there's a way, if I can bring my two great loves together, one of which is painting and the other which is cinema, then I'm extremely happy. Let me push on a bit because I want to be able, and I haven't given you much time here, I'm talking about architecture. One of my favorite architects is Buckminster Fuller. Have you all heard of Buckminster Fuller? Died probably about 40 years ago. He was able to hold an audience enthralled without boring them silly for 8 hours. I'm sorry, they've only given me 1 hour. A design museum in Milan about 3 or 4 years ago suggested that I should make an introductory film about Italian design. You know, the Italians, Ferrari, Olivetti, Armani, etc., regard themselves as very good designers, and with due respect, they're probably right. They wanted really to only talk about contemporary design, which would go back probably to about the end of the Second World War, but I suggested let's open it up a bit more, and considering the notion of the medium as the message, let's make a production which is as much about the medium, indeed, as the message. Well, let me give you an idea. I'm standing on the stage in front of a screen, and all pictures basically don't have to be, certainly don't have to be now, are parallelograms, rectangles. Basic ratio now is, what is it, 16 by 9. Didn't used to be like that. There were all sorts of proportions you could choose in the 50s and the 60s, but now we have standardized all over the world 16 by 9. You can play with that ratio, of course, by chopping and cropping and projecting in various ways. So I suggested, let's make a situation where what you project on a screen is relative to the screen, which hardly ever happens. Hardly ever happens, because we're all subject, to the same format. They said, all right, and we put up a situation in a huge Mussolini building, built about 1944, on the edges of Milan. First of all, I'm interested in multi-screens because I don't think the notion of a single screen is particularly valuable anymore, and there have been so many examples. I mean, let's just talk about the frame. You don't see me in a frame, and I certainly don't see you in a frame. A frame does not exist in the natural world at all, at all, at all. A completely man-made phenomenon. And there's a way also the frame, by being a static phenomenon with 4 right angles, is an impossibility. I have, like you, a gyroscopic head, which is always on the move, and I've got eyes that are never still. I think the only time our eyes are still is when we're dead. So the notion of a static frame is impossible. You can never see the world in a static frame. So remember, it's totally, totally artificial. So bearing that in mind as one of those sort of, I suppose, confounding contradictions about the notion of a cinematic image, that's one of them. The second one, and this is going to be much more difficult for you, I suppose, to agree with, there's no such thing as a story. The stories do not exist. Don't tell me your life's a story. That's ridiculous if you think about it. Where do we enter, where do we exit, how long do you live, how long you don't live, etc., etc., etc. The story of your life to your grandmother, your lover, your doctor, your cat are all different, so how can they be definitive? So just as the frame is a totally artificial phenomenon, so is the story. So why, and I think we discussed this already, we have to concern ourselves with story, again, it's a very, very debatable situation. Anyway, let me come back. Here is my little Roman red communist adult, certain height, gives you a sense of scale. We're very big here. And I wanted, first of all, a shape that would be relative to all the global shots, if you like. So we have 1/4 of the world's surface. This is 2 dimensions. I want you to think of it in 3 dimensions, and I'll show you why in a minute. So my wide shots then are going to be relative to that particular screen. Then I'm in Rome. I'm in Milan. I'm in Italy. And I think the Italians, any Italians in the audience? The Italians invented the triumphal arch. Just look at their army and you can see why. There's a way then that all the sort of grand set pieces should be relative to the space on which you want to be able to use the content and the medium as the message. Since basically the way of construction in the world, despite Libeskind and Gehry and architecture, is still always basically the classical notion of a grid created by horizontals and verticals. So I give myself the biggest, widest, greater than CinemaScope screen to be able, in a sense, to represent the horizon. And if I do that, then I must also do the opposite and give me a vertical screen. You notice it's a bit like a trapezium, because I want to indicate to you this is a 3-dimensional phenomenon. And then, since I have an awful lot to say, as you probably already realize, I give myself 3 more screens. So we have 7 screens here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That should be a large amount of information space for me to promote to you a history of Italian design in the world. Have a look and see what we did. So if we could take the house lights down, please.